Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Intellectual Agrarian podcast, where we talk philosophy from the farm. I'm your host, Terrence Lakeview. The act of farming frequently requires faith to see it through. Our guest today is Noah Sanders, author of Born Again Dirt, Farming to the Glory of God. Today, we'll discuss how he started farming, why he wrote Born Again Dirt, what having Born Again Dirt means, and so much more. You won't want to miss this episode with Noah Sanders. Noah Sanders, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Terrence, for having me.
Now, before we get into your book, which I'm really excited to talk about, can you share with us a little bit about how you started farming, what got you interested in it?
Yes, I was homeschooled, and as part of that, really found that I loved working with my hands and creating things, being outside. I also love the lifestyle of kind of family-based learning and the family lifestyle. And so as I was trying to decide what I wanted to do, I really wanted to have some type of business that allowed me to work with my family. And as a follower of Jesus, I'm really just trying to figure out with my life, like, how can I be about the things God's told me to be about, bringing glory to him through taking care of his creation, whether that's, dirt all the way up to technology. And then how can I, as I do that, love and serve other people? And I think like a homestead was always something that attracted me. I was one of the young boys that like kind of the concept of going into the woods by myself with a knife and being able to survive off the land. But, I think farming is a little more civilized way to do that with a family.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked into things like I had a blacksmithing business for a while and piddled some with repairing musical instruments, something that I, figured I could have a shop off on the side of my homestead and make a living doing that. But then I like many people that got into farming, was lent You Can Farm by Joel Salatin. And my dad had grown up in Indiana, and we come from a line of farmers up there. But once it got to my dad, the farm had kind of been split up through the generations until, they just had to sell it because of inheritance taxes when his dad passed away. So the only model he had been exposed to was sort of the get big or get out commodity scale farming that became prevalent up there. And once we read Joel Salatin's book, it kind of opened our eyes to the idea of more of a retail, scalable, kind of creative model of farming that I really liked because of Joel Salatin's worldview of trying to copy God's design in nature and imitate that in his production models as much as he could. And because of that, I started on a small scale where we lived. We lived on about 11 acres near Auburn, Alabama. And growing up, my dad encouraged me to learn useful skills. So I worked with most of my friends when I was in my teens. I joke because I'd get off the phone and say I was talking to one of my friends, but most of them were over 60. And they were older gentlemen that I would go and work with and learn things from, whether it was mechanics or, go work on their sawmill or help them with their beehives or a lot of those things. And so learned a lot of useful skills like that, but ended up starting on a small scale where we lived in Auburn, just doing some chickens and gardening. And then my dad was interested in sort of having a family home place with a piece of land that could kind of replace like the family farm that they had and the legacy that they sort of lost in Indiana. And even, though not all the family might farm, but this just be a place that can connect the family and future generations. I think even in the Bible we see, the way God set it up in Israel, like the land reverted to its original family ownership every 70 years because it allowed the families to have some type of accountable connection with the previous generations. My dad wanted something like that. I wanted to be able to farm. And so we sort of partnered together where I provided a lot of the research and muscle to develop the land, and my dad bought it. And we ended up building my dad's house first. And I started the first year of the commercial side of the farm in 2009, kind of doing what I had done on a small scale, but ramping it up after writing a business plan and doing market research. And then the next year I got married, and then I'm still building my house here 8 years later. But I have now a wife and 4 little children, one not here yet.
Congratulations.
So 3 boys here and 1 on the way. So we're very blessed, and I'm very blessed to be able to be doing what we're doing.
That's awesome. One little note I want to make is wanting to go into the woods with a knife and survive on your own. When I grew up, I was also homeschooled. I loved Davy Crockett. Fess Parker's Davy Crockett was my bread and butter. And yeah. I thought here I was going to be this wilderness explorer. I was going to hunt and trap. But then I found out what was involved in the process. And somehow I started becoming more of a bookworm and less of a trapper from that experience. But that's really awesome. It's congratulations on the kid to come. That's great.
Thanks. Yeah, we're very excited.
Now, tell me about the farm itself. What's the farm's name, and what do you guys do?
So the name of the farm is Rora Valley Farms. It's RORA, and we started in 2009, and our key products have been vegetables, eggs, and meat chickens. We've done some other things as well. We also do some baked goods, home baked goods. But it's one of those, it's interesting how God changes, sometimes your plan. I think God honors planning, but he likes to tweak it and shift it around where, you can't really take the credit for it coming off at the end of the day. So I planned on vegetables being my main product for the first season, did a whole business plan and marketing and everything like that. Ended up my garden flooded. And somebody offered to sell me a guy that I've been learning how to do chickens from sold me his operation for a really good deal. And so eggs ended up being my major income source. And at the end of the year, I still made like the same amount that I was shooting for, but it was totally switched around in terms of where the income came from. So yeah, we've sold primarily at farmers markets. I really tried to, do good marketing at the beginning and actually over-marketed myself where I didn't have enough time to produce because I was trying to do farmers market and shift into CSA. And then all the days I budgeted for production, it rained.
Mm-hmm.
So,
of course.
Yeah. So we ended up, we sell at a really good farmers market that we have really, it's one of those that you can sell a lot of product and there's thousands and thousands of people that come through every Saturday. And we gained a pretty good following there and reputation for our eggs and our produce. So we've stuck with that. This past year, I've swapped to something that we're really excited about. I felt like, there's a lot of good farmers out there showing how to really crunch the numbers and be profitable with small acreage on vegetables, which is actually my personal passion. I like animals and stuff, but I really like the vegetables. But I found myself kind of shifting more almost to just like a numbers driven business model.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, my dad shared something with me. He said, kind of the way God set things up is resources come from right relationships. And sometimes it's easy to pursue the profit and not realize that it's actually the relationships, that if you look at so many successful businesses and even my business in the previous years, it's all about who God connects you with and the people that you know in those relationships. And we also like knowing who our customers are. So we've developed a new kind of foundation for financial foundation model that's not all of our marketing, but we call it kind of like a farm ship model. It's sort of like a customized, modified CSA where we have 20 families that support us for a certain amount per month, and then we supply them with baked goods, vegetables, eggs, and meat. And then we just have a steady cash flow every month, and they don't exactly get that certain amount every month, but we connect with them through farm dinners and really have a very close relationship with those 20 families, and they sort of sponsor our farm in a sense in return for us growing, being their own personal homesteaders, and we've really enjoyed that. So our what we grow above and beyond that is what's going to go to the farmers market now. But this past year, my cousin came on board the farm, and he's doing all the animals, and I'm doing the vegetables and the baked goods with my wife, which is exciting and fun, and then the marketing. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
That is so awesome. And there are a couple of points I want to make on what you just said, but honestly, one of the things I really enjoyed about Born Again Dirt is you had a spot where you talked about we make plans and then God actually does what he does. And that really spoke to me personally because I'm one of those planner people. And I mean, if I had, at the age of 13, I was the kid walking around with a briefcase. If I had been told that that I would be in agriculture as an organic inspector and doing this podcast, I would have told them I was nuts. I was assuming that I was going to be an accountant at the time. And yet now here's where God has me. And I wouldn't have it any other way. That's truly the remarkable thing. And really, I love resources come from right relationships. That is such a great quote. I am taking it. I hope you don't mind. That's awesome. I love that.
No, it's not mine originally, so pass it on.
So, in all this process, what inspired you to write Born Again Dirt?
So, when I first started getting into farming, at a young age, I just recognized, the fact that I was not perfect. I had broken relationships with my own self and people around me, and even God's creation because of my broken relationship with God. So I became a follower of Jesus, and it's just been exciting ever since. So I kind of view my main career as following Christ. That's everything else just comes from that. So farming was just like, how can I glorify God and love other people, the two greatest commandments, love God and love others, through agriculture. And, for me, it's kind of like, okay, so glorifying God a lot of times just means, you find how you can excel in what you're doing and do it with good character, and be honest and bring the morals that a biblical perspective brings to it. But what was confusing with farming was, if you want, you go out and you say, I want to be an excellent farmer, then you start getting all these conflicting opinions on what excellent farming is. That maybe there's hot debates within other fields, but like when I was doing blacksmithing, I mean, it was pretty straightforward on the techniques and how you do that. But farming, man, you have the people that were like extreme organic, that if I was a successful commodity farmer, they would say I was a bad farmer, and then vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of was like, why? How does God want me to farm? Because there's all these conflicting. We kind of talk about those two camps. You have that nobody really ultimately falls into, but two ideologies, kind of the extreme form of kind of the environmental type farming, which really just elevates nature, and the other side of extreme sort of industrial mindset that really elevates science and how man can manipulate nature. And as I looked at both of them, I was trying to figure out, I tend towards more the organic because of the fact that it seems to like appreciate God's wisdom in nature, but so many, except for Joel Salatin, so many of the ideologies behind them were not lining up with my own.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was kind of like, well, really the differences here seem to fall in a worldview issue. And the extreme kind of environmental side really worship nature, sort of the creation, and to the point that sort of some of the extremes were where we don't even need to touch it, and man is sort of a blight on the face of the earth, and sort of the minimal disturbance and nature's prime in its natural state, and then the extreme industrial model. There's problems with destruction of resources and stuff. So the reason I wrote Born Again Dirt was because I wanted to ask the question of how should a biblical perspective impact the way that I do farming, and how can my methods and the way that I approach it flow from that, rather than just like trying to pick a side or something where I'm adopting methods that are developed by people who don't share what I value, and I may be unknowingly promoting or not living consistent with what I believe. And I think I listened to a previous podcast that you had on that integrity gap.
Yes.
And I think a lot of us have that. A big purpose of me writing the book is because I felt like we have this integrity gap between what we as Christians say we believe, or maybe we don't even say we believe. We don't even know the Bible says it sometimes. But a big gap between what the Bible teaches and what we do, and it's not necessarily intentional sometimes. It's just because we haven't ever really thought about it. We don't even think that it applies. And we think it's a separate issue. Our spiritual life and what we believe is, what does that have to do with farming? I mean, I'm not going to cheat, lie, and steal, but, what does it apply beyond that? And I really feel like it was really, really important because, some of the effects and the repercussions of some of these ideologies, if taken to their extreme end, is not going to help people. And that it was really just not the born again dirt. The concept of what born again dirt means is that it's sort of a play on words. But first of all, Adam was originally made from dirt or the dust of the ground. So that's sort of like an image of both us and the soil we work. And the idea is that if we are born again, if we claim to have a new heart, a new perspective, a new ability to love people because of what Jesus has done in our lives, if that should impact what we do, like our dirt should be born again too. We if our heart changes, our hand should change as well. And I wanted, look for resources about that and ended up not finding any. So, like many people, I wrote the book I wish I could read, mainly just to raise questions so that I wanted to challenge Christians to think about that integrity gap and begin to be more purposeful in living out their worldview.
I think that the best books are written when it's answering the question that when scratching the itch that we couldn't find something to scratch it with. That's
right.
When you get a really good book. And I love your perspective on this because, I mean, the Israelites were an agrarian society at the heart of it. And so, of course, the law has so much about how they're supposed to farm. God himself telling the Israelites, I want you to do this, this, and this in your farms. How many of us think about that? I mean, honestly, until I read your book, I really hadn't given that much consideration to, the Bible, of course, tells people how to farm. It's a great concept. And I love that the book, it can be a devotional just as much as a book on farming.
Yeah, and I don't believe that, the Bible is there for us to legalistically say, here's the methods God supports, and so, if you're a Christian, you should be doing these things, and if you grow GMOs, then obviously you don't love God. That's not, I believe, the spirit we need to come approach it by. But I think the idea of the gospel, we tend to think that's just, admit that you're a sinner, confess to God your sin, commit your life to Jesus and live for him. And then you sort of get your fire insurance and you move on. But the gospel is the idea that at the beginning, God, when he created everything, he made these like four relationships. There's relationship with himself. There's man's relationship. There's man's relationship to God, man's relationship to himself, like his identity, and then man's relationship with others and man's relationship with God's creation. And that, if you think about it, all of our everyday, all revolves around those different relationships. But the whole idea of the gospel is that when we, turned away and chose not to follow the good way of the good creator, that the destruction that resulted broke both our relationship with ourselves, and so we have all these self-image issues and depression and all these issues with ourselves that we now deal with. There's the issue with other people, and what the fall created was shame in terms of our relationship with ourselves and our view of ourselves, because the man was hiding from God. He no longer had confidence in who he was. Blame in relation to other people. And then the third relationship of God's creation is, pain, and it's not hard, and it doesn't willingly produce fruit for us. And and there's pain related to that. And yet what happens is when we talk about how Christ can heal our perspective of ourselves, how Christ changes and heals the relationships we have with people around us. But we don't often talk about how Christ and the work that he does in our heart changes our ability to and heals our interaction with his creation as well. And so we're missing that whole element, that restorative element of the gospel.
If this is your first, fifth, sixth, or 12th helping of the show, we aren't going to tell you to stop like Aunt Mildred during dessert. Instead, we want to send you our top episodes in what we call the grocery bag, because they're about the food you eat and how it's grown, knowledge that you can take straight to the kitchen. Go to intellectualagrarian.com/bag. Once again, that's intellectualagrarian.com/bag to get the grocery bag sent directly to your inbox, or click on the link below. There, we've got great episodes about farm-to-table dining, organic grains, and so much more. So be sure to go to that link and get the grocery bag for knowledge that you can take straight to the kitchen. Now, back to the show. Now, in the book, you also have a chapter on principles of God's design. Can we go over a couple of these?
Sure.
So the first is that it's soil-based, and you give the example of the parable of the sower as an illustration. How does the parable of the sower illustrate what good soil looks like?
Well, first of all, I think the biggest takeaway I have from the parable of the sower is the difference between the soil that produced a good crop. I mean, the difference between the crop that produced abundantly and the crop that didn't produce anything was the dirt. It wasn't the bugs or the weather or, all these symptoms. It was the dirt that was the ultimate, determining factor in how that crop produced. And so that's why when I say soil-based, I'm saying on my farm, when I have issues that I face with my crops or my animals, a lot of times it's like, okay, well, there's a problem with the dirt. It's not the bug's fault. It's not the disease's fault per se. They're just coming in, and showing me that I have a problem with my soil. So that's really, and obviously Christ was relating that to the heart. So, if same thing applies if I'm angry, if I'm just discouraged or things like that, then it's not because of what other people are doing to me per se, or my environment.
Yeah.
It's because of the heart issue.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the things that we see that good soil isn't is you have the seed that fell on the path, and the path is hard and compacted. So, good soil obviously is not going to be heavily tread upon. The soil that was shallow and rocky. So we need soil that has depth to it for the roots to be able to penetrate. And then the weedy soil, good soil needs to have to not have too much competition for the plants that you actually want to grow there. And then if we just look at the general principle of what is God said is good and what reflects his nature, life and abundance reflects him. So we would expect good soil to be full of life and not to be dead and sterile.
Mm-hmm. Now, the second point was that it's seasonal. Now, how have you applied seasonal production to your farm?
Well, I think this is one of those areas that I don't, it's not like I want to get legalistic about it, but I want to really see, I want my farm to reflect God's nature and to ascribe to him saying he made it all. And so it's kind of like if somebody made something and he's telling me how to use it, then for me to say, totally disregard what they say would be foolish. Now, at the same time, God did give us the ability to manage his creation. He wants us to utilize his creation for increased output. And I think that's where I differ a little bit from the extreme environmental model is I believe that the earth was created for man, waiting for good stewardship, and then it blossoms into abundance with good stewardship. So it's like there's a stable amount of productivity in nature that obviously we can make it worse. But I also believe, I think it's in Isaiah, God says, I formed the earth to be inhabited. And so when there is a degree of management that God expects and allows us to do. So, but it has to be balanced. So seasonality for me means my expectation is that my plants and my animals are going to be happier and healthier if I can pay attention to the times and the seasons and the cycles that they were designed to function in. So, an example might be, I got asked a question a few weeks ago by a lady who was raising some chickens, and she said, I'm struggling with putting lights on my chickens so that they can produce more. Is that dishonoring the way God created them, or I want to balance that with being able to make a profit off of it. So a lot of that just comes down to making sure that what you're doing, your motivation is to honor God, and not just to be legalistic about it or to just give yourself license to do whatever you want to. For me personally, that means I'm trying to let my chickens, I don't put any lights on my chickens and let them cycle, because my assumption is there's a benefit to that. Even if I don't know exactly what it is, I would like to discover that benefit. Now, if I wanted to put lights on there, I might not gain that benefit, but I don't think I would be sinning either. So, I do some season extension with my vegetables, but I'm not just growing in a, completely controlled environment at the same time. So that's kind of how I approach it a little bit on my farm.
The fourth point was, your third point was intended roles. Could you expand a little bit on this idea? What I think most of us, when we just hear intended roles, we think of a patriarchal society, but that's not what you're going for when you talk about God's design having intended roles.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of like my sons, when they are taking one of my tools or something that we have, and they're playing with it around the house, and they're, throwing it, or they're, using it in some way other than it was intended, then I have to instruct them on, like, this is not the role of this particular tool. If you use a tool other than its intended role, then there's a danger that you can, cause harm to that, or that it's not going to be very useful. It's sort of like, a wrench, that fits. It works better than a wrench that wasn't meant to fit that. So the idea is, if God's beautiful design and creation, when people ask me how I raise my chickens or how I raise my vegetables, I just tell them, what we try to do is we try to look at how God created chickens to be happy and to thrive in nature, and we try to copy that as close as we can, not because we scientifically know and can prove that the eggs are technically better or whatever, but that's just my assumption that I start with. And it comes from, that's why I like a lot of what permaculture has done, because they're very good at observing the roles of things in creation and trying to honor those roles. And the beauty of God is that when we function within some of his design and parameters, like there's actually, we don't lose anything, we actually gain at the end of the day, so the more that we can take what he's given us and adapt it to how he honored it, just like when we use that right size wrench, then there's efficiency and abundance that comes from that. So again, I feel like some of these you're trying to excel and do better by imitating God's wisdom, but at the same time, it doesn't mean necessarily that if you're not doing it a certain way that you're sinning. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's similar to a lot of organic farming principles that, well, in that case, it is actually a law that you're supposed to be going to if you want to be organic, but these are principles and practices that if you're following these methods, you are going to find that your farm is operating in accordance with nature. It's working with the stream, if you will, rather than kind of trying to go against the stream.
Right. And there's occasionally times that, like, you have to, to do something in order to, let's say, grow, some vegetables in a place that they don't normally naturally grow. And I think God likes us making the land more abundant than it would have been naturally. But we just have to count the cost of that increased input that's required for it to do that.
Now, the last point you have here, the fourth one, is probably the one that I personally resonated with most. I just find it the most interesting of these. But rest periods, giving the land an opportunity for rest. Can you explain how giving the land an opportunity of rest increases production in the long run?
Yeah, well, I feel like rest scripturally, you can approach it legalistically, but I really like to say, what's God's heart behind, why he, because it's not just farming that we see rest applying to in scripture, but there's, God rested on the seventh day after creating. I mean, he has unlimited energy, but he was modeling for us something that I feel like rest has to do with this acknowledging that we have to trust in God ultimately at the end of the day to provide for us, and we don't have to just utilize, take every moment, and it's not all up to us. Like, it literally takes faith on the farm to be, if you're going to rest one day, then and that's the best day for planting. You just have to decide, like, am I going to trust that God's going to give me another day, to plant or not? And so there's a faith element there. And I think the other element is that God adds to those who are generous, so when we give back to something, then it's not a loss. Generosity actually produces, as you measure, it will be measured to you. And rest, well, let's say working, I feel like when we manage creation for increased output, that's working it. I mean, the land, just when you're increasing the output of it, when you're like a pasture, maybe you could let that rest. That wasn't something that God necessarily specified that should rest. So it's hard to know, where you draw the line between what's work and what's rest. But when we give generously, and we take time to invest in something rather than just getting something from it. It's just the same thing as like taking a vacation with your family, where or taking a date with your wife, or taking a Sunday to be able to go and fellowship with people and spend more time with God. You're taking time to invest in things so that, the rest of the time they actually benefit more. And so on my farm, I have, some people might do, like they did in Israel, and let their land rest every 7 years, which is a cool idea. I personally just set aside like a portion of my land every year to just give back to it, to plant a cover crop, to, run some animals on it, to just kind of, to invest in that particular piece of land, so that when I'm ready to work at the next season, that ideally it's going to be more abundant than it would have been otherwise. And I think it's that same thing. We always think more is more, but more is not always more, because it's only what you can be faithful with. Faithfulness is what produces profit, not just quantity. And so rest sort of forces us to limit how much we work, which actually increases the quality of our work, which then increases the actual profitability and productivity of our work.
I really loved how you drew a delineation between what rest and neglect is. I'm an organic inspector on the side, and one of the things that we kind of have a phrase in inspections is that there are sometimes farms that are organic by neglect, simply because half of organics is managing your inputs, and these farms have zero inputs and really zero management, and somehow still qualifies as organic. So could you expand a little bit on what the difference between neglect and rest is?
Yeah, well, I feel like neglect, when you let something rest, then say like on a Sunday, you're not going to be working, but I don't think nobody in history has thought that means that you don't take care of the needs of your family, like providing them food, even if you did cook it the day before, or like, if your animal has a need and falls in a ditch, then you get it out. That's not working your animal, because God, He always is taking care of us. If He neglected us, it would be, we would cease to exist, basically. But that idea of resting has to do with it's for the benefit of the thing that you're letting rest. And it's like a refreshing. It's something that I haven't really done a good job with in the past with like my family. There's sort of the idea that you work, and then when you rest, you just don't work. That's what rest means. But sometimes it's not very refreshing, just to like cease from activity, rather than saying, how then can I refresh my family? How can we invest in taking care of the needs that we don't sometimes have time to take care of, to have extended times of, communication with my wife, or things of that nature. So the same thing with like my rest plot. When they're resting, it doesn't mean I let them grow up in weeds and be abused. It means that I'm actually now have more time to plant the cover crop, to rotate some animals through it, because it's going to be a long enough time before the next crop, that I can do that, and, do some things to invest in that piece. And I feel like that's, it's sort of a duh when you think about it, but it really is, it sort of makes it more attractive to take those rests, because then when you realize it's an opportunity to invest in things that you don't normally have time to do when you're working.
And I love how you give that example, because when my father rests, he enjoys working on the house. He's an electrician by trade growing up, and now he's worked in farming. And as you know, the electrician's house is the last one to actually have electrical put in it. But the continual process, his version of rest is being able to still do something with his hands, but he enjoys working with my younger siblings, having them hand him the tools. He's resting, and he's taking that opportunity to invest in my younger siblings and showing them kind of what work can be without really working hard. In my case, I use rest as an opportunity to read a book that I may not have to read, but just kind of want to read, and will get some benefit from it because I'm always trying to draw the benefit from something that I read. So I just really like how rest doesn't mean that you have to do nothing. And I think we have a lot of that in the culture today.
It actually takes work to do rest well.
Yes, it takes practice too.
Purposefulness, to actually really be refreshed when you're done with it. And there's something I've been trying to do more of now is like actually say I'm not going to think about work when I'm on the weekend or whatever those times are that I delegate for myself, so that I'm ready to get back to it when I'm ready to when I do get back to it, and that I also can take time to enjoy other things that my mental capacity doesn't have room for when I'm in the middle of a farming week.
And I think that is a very important point for farmers, because stereotypically farmers can work themselves to death very easily by just continuing moving without ever just kind of stepping back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the balance issue. Is I think we can fall into this idea of success being just measured in one area of our life. And I think in your interview with Chris Blanchard, he was talking about the idea that for us men, sometimes work is an easy escape. Like, it's a very easy place to get results. And so we can escape to that. But God, like, his version of success is more like, my dad always talked like a triathlon, where you have to bike and you have to swim and you have to run and all that. And like, you can't just be a good biker and not know how to swim and win the race. Like, you literally it's better to be a mediocre biker and a mediocre swimmer and a mediocre runner, because it doesn't mean you're mediocre. It means actually you're a great triathlon, athlete, to be able to do that. So in my life, like, I need to evaluate how's my relationship, my marriage, and how am I doing in my marriage? How am I doing in my community? Taking time for other people. How am I doing in even my hobbies? Like you said, like your dad, something that gives me a break from the normal work that I do, and invest in other gifts that I have. Because at the end of the day, I was telling my boys the other day, I'm like, if you have the best crops in the world, but a farmer doesn't love his wife, is he successful? Is he a successful farmer? Or if his kids, he's running away his kids because he abuses them, is he a successful farmer? And I'm just trying to point out to them that no, that's like the world may give you some accolade, but at the end of the day, what you're investing in eternity has not been worthwhile. So as farmers, we really have to avoid that trap, and even be willing to be less than some people, like less successful, or make less money per acre in order to be successful according to God's definition. Sometimes we're willing to stand before kings for God, but we're not willing to be obscure for him, which he has different roles for different people. So
I love that sentiment. Now, before we wrap up here, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
Well, I would love to share a little bit about my connection with some folks in Africa and what I've learned from them.
I would love to hear about it.
So after I wrote Born Again Dirt, had some opportunities to speak and to share with different people, but at the moment I am 29, so it was several years ago that I wrote my book. So as a young man, I'm like, I really need to continue to be learning and finding older men to mentor under. And I ended up going to Zimbabwe over in Africa to learn from a organization called Foundations for Farming that was started by a white African, way back in the 80s. And whereas Joel Salatin is probably one of the premier, pioneers in doing well with animal husbandry, this gentleman named Brian Oldreive was probably one of the pioneers in sustainable crop production over there. He was doing no-till, before they're like over there, and just, this was way back in the early 80s when people were doing some over here but none over there. And he became one of the most successful farmers in Africa, but it came as a result of him losing his farm and being unprofitable, and then basically just going to the woods and saying, God, I obviously am missing something, teach me how to farm. And from that, he just took away two principles in nature. He never saw any plowing, deep inversion plowing every year, and that there was always a mulch cover on the ground. And so he just started applying that on his farm, and just an amazing story from that we could do a whole podcast on. So I'll just say from that, they ended up going from being bankrupt to the people he was working for had the second largest privately owned farm in Africa at the time. But today I think the average yield of corn per hectare over there is under 1 ton, and he was getting over 10 tons per hectare.
Wow.
With very, very minimal inputs. And this was before GMOs or anything like that. They were at the beginning using some herbicide early in the season, but obviously couldn't do it, later. So, and he was one of the first white, as far as I know, to employ black managers, and there's just a whole amazing story with him. So I ended up going over there because I listened to some talks from some conferences they had, because God told him that he hadn't given him this technology to just make him successful and rich, that it was actually for the poor of Africa. And so he began teaching these to the rural poor, and over the course of the past 30 years, it's been made an incredible impact all over Africa, and now kind of around the world. Some of the things that they've taught. So I went and learned from them for a couple weeks, and it's just amazing to be like, these are some of the best farmers I'd ever seen in the world, and they were more on fire for Jesus than I'd ever, people that I'd ever met. The farmers, some of the Brian Oldreive and another guy, Craig Deal there, both of them were extremely successful, large-scale, multi-million-dollar operation white farmers in Zimbabwe, and they lost their land in the early 2000s. They had everything taken away from them. They basically, got away with what they had in their car. And instead of choosing to flee or to fight, they chose to forgive, and they actually now are serving and teaching the very people who took away their farms how to farm. And as a result, with the collapse of the country, the people that they taught were the only people that were successfully feeding themselves and having enough to sell to others. And this was just a hoe. No fancy machinery, just very, very basic technique. And so after I went over and learned from them, I came back, and that's actually kind of what motivated me to host a few conferences, the Redeeming the Dirt conferences, where I had some of these people from Africa over, and they shared, some of their story. And at the moment, in addition to farming, I also have a blog. My book is Born Again Dirt, but my blog and company is Redeeming the Dirt, and I'm actually part of the Foundations for Farming Network worldwide now as the U.S. representative, and our goal is to use agriculture as a means to disciple people and bring hope to the poor, specifically trying to say God's kingdom, the way that he heals a nation is not top down. The way we heal our problems in agriculture, the problems with our society, is not top down. Actually, it's starting with the very last, the least, and the lost. And agriculture is a great entry point because it's it's where you have to begin economically in order to be able to address the brokenness, and then it gives you a great opportunity to be able to talk about, when you talk about how Jesus changes our view of agriculture and produces some of the best agriculture in the world, then you can say, well, what about our marriages? What about our finances? What about our kids? How can we apply these principles there as well? And it's more of a whole life transformation that the different foundations for farming stations, of which ours is the first U.S. We have several other farms. It's just a farm that is purposely modeling, for the community, what living for Christ looks like, and we do trainings and education in agriculture. So in addition to farming, I also do teaching on the side as well, as part of kind of the Foundations for Farming network through our Redeeming the Dirt conferences and companies. So that's something that we're really, really excited about. We feel like our farm is disciple making is all about modeling for people around you. It's not just about telling them what to do, but it's showing them. And so farming is a really great way to provide a place to show the joy that Christ can bring and how he begins to address the poverty in our lives. And then we can point them to Christ and then just share with them what we've learned and learn from them as well. So that's something that really excites me, and we have sort of a growing team of core people that we're supporting each other in different things around the country. But I really feel like God is calling his church to be leaders in agriculture, and because I feel like in the future there'll be a need for voices within agriculture to provide solutions for problems that we face with our food supply. And I really want to see Christ followers be those equipped to excel in agriculture and to point the source of that excellence back to Christ. So we'll see how that happens, but God definitely seems to be doing a work, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
I'm excited for you. This is a great idea. We're definitely going to have to do another interview with you sometime to expand on these ideas. So where can people go to learn more about you, your farm, your work, and your book?
So most all of it's under, and I know it can be confusing because the book is Born Again Dirt, but redeemingthedirt.com. You can look up Redeeming the Dirt on Facebook and Redeeming the Dirt on YouTube to be able to find out more. And you can also find the book Born Again Dirt on Amazon.
Thanks again, Noah.
Thanks so much.
Big thanks to Noah for being on the show today. You can find more about Rora Valley Farms by going to roravalleyfarms.com. Also, be sure to read Noah's book, Born Again Dirt, Farming to the Glory of God. Links to all of this and more are in the show notes below. Thanks again for listening. If you're new to the show, be sure to subscribe on whatever listening medium you get your podcast content on. While you're there, new or old to the show, be sure to leave a nice review. This has been Terrence Lehue and the Intellectual Agrarian Podcast, reminding you to keep farming the dream.